I'm often quoted as saying I would rather be governed by the first 2,000 people in the Boston Telephone Directory than by the 2,000 people on the faculty of Harvard University.
In this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem.
They share our beliefs, our convictions, our hopes, and our dreams. These are the conservatives of the heart. They are our people.
Join the best in the movement. It's Conservative Conversations with ISI, educating for liberty since 1953.
Welcome. You're listening to Conservative Conversations with Johnny and James. I'm Johnny Burtka, the president of the Intercollegiate Studies Institute.
And I'm James Davenport, the academic program officer.
We're glad to have you here for the first episode of the Conservative Conversations podcast. James, why don't you tell them a little bit about why we're doing this show?
Conservative ideas are no longer welcome on most college campuses, or anywhere else for that matter. If you are a conservative college student or professor, then you already know what I'm talking about. If you are hungry for conservative ideas, look no further. This is the podcast for you. Presented by the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, this podcast is a series of in-depth conversations with leading thinkers of the past and present on the most important issues facing conservatism. Join myself and ISI President Johnny Burtka and dig into the world of conservative ideas. To listen, go to isi.org/podcast or any of your favorite podcast platforms.
James, one of the reasons I'm really excited about this podcast is because it helps to bridge together two worlds. First, we have the world that our students are living in on college campuses where they really don't have access to many conservative ideas or conservative professors, and so they're able to discover the great tradition of conservative thought for the first time. But at the same time, ISI as an institution has been around for almost 70 years, and we have a remarkable number of prominent alumni who've come through our programs, and we have relationships with those alumni. So this podcast really is able to connect those alumni and those friends of ISI with our students on campus and sort of give them inside access to the world of conservative ideas. So I'm really eager to get these episodes going and get them in front of our students.
Absolutely, I agree. I think it'll be a great way for people, both alumni and alumni supporter and student, to dig into the ideas with us, dig into the ideas with ISI.
Fantastic. Well, let's begin our show today, as we will from here on out, with an ISI student member question. Our question this week is from Brian Lauer. To what extent do conservatives believe in legislating morality and or tradition? James, what do you think?
Well, that's a huge question, obviously. Look, I don't know if there is one sort of conservative standard on this, right? I think that there's conservatives who are maybe a little more free market oriented, who might say, well, government really shouldn't be legislating much morality, maybe very, very little bit, right? But then there are other conservatives who would rather impose more restrictions, right, and sort of try to go in that direction. What do you think about that, Johnny?
Yeah, I think it's really important to look at the question from a foundational perspective. So any free society needs a moral framework and a moral foundation in order for it to work. And so obviously, to some extent, any law that's in existence is legislating a type of morality. It's setting boundaries for acceptable conduct. And as conservatives, and many of us as Christians or Jews or from other religious traditions, believe in the inherent dignity of the human person, believe in the right to life, and that each and every human being is made in the image of God. So any just society is going to protect that image from being distorted. And so to the extent that the boundaries of a free society are set in order to preserve the foundational nature of our, human dignity, then I think that is legislating morality in a way that works for us here in America and will ultimately lead to a healthy and vibrant society.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, there are certain things about which, even in a sort of more liberal society, everyone can kind of agree on, or at least you would think everyone can kind of agree on. And so in that sense, I think it is good to legislate morality. But also, I think a persistent, as long as the conservative movement goes, I think it'll be a constant battle within the movement as to what extent.
Absolutely. And where do you draw the lines? And we're seeing this, with the pornography issue is one that really blew up in the conservative world. I think about it. Well, it's blew up many times in the conservative world, but specifically a year ago, I think there was a more concerted effort for legislation towards banning pornography. And I think, from my perspective, certainly an area where there would be a lot of common ground to start would be targeting pornography that impacts minors. I think you'd find a lot of common ground, even left and right, on that issue. But certainly there are many downstream effects of that question.
Absolutely. And thank you for your question. And for our other listeners, if you'd like to submit a question for the next episode, just leave a review of the show wherever you are listening and leave a question in that review, and we'll sift through them and pick the best one for our next episode. So, Johnny, what are you reading right now?
Yeah, good question. So I am reading a book called First Principles by historian Thomas Ricks. And basically, Ricks is looking at the education of the first 4 American presidents. And it's a very interesting book. He's talking about the influence of specific Greek and Roman philosophers and statesmen on our founders. So he compares Cato's influence and Cincinnatus's influence on Washington, Cicero's influence on Adams, and Epicurus's influence on Jefferson. And he makes the case that the founding was more classical in nature than Enlightenment in nature. So the classics played a bigger role than John Locke, for example. And he continues to return to the theme of public virtue, saying that the idea of putting the common good over one's personal interests was very important for the founders and certainly exemplified in the life of George Washington, who could have become a king if he wanted to, but decided to step down after 2 terms in office. So what are you reading, James?
Yeah, I mean, that sounds like a fascinating book. I'm going to have to check that out. But right now I'm working on a couple things. One in particular is The Enduring Tension, Don Devine's latest book. And so that has been really fascinating. The subtitle book is Capitalism and the Moral Order. And it's really interesting because he's, in a way, it sort of seems to maybe he's doing, the world according to a fusionist kind of thing, right? But in addition, he has this interesting sub-theme, critiquing Pope Francis, actually.
Interesting.
And so that's been fascinating. I don't know if Devine is a Catholic himself, but he's brought up some really good things. He's doing it tastefully, right? Like some people critique the Pope these days, and it's not so tasteful. But I think it's been a really enlightening book and has sort of put meat on the bones of fusionism for me. If that makes sense.
Very interesting. Yeah, and Don Devine is, of course, a longtime friend and ISI author and works at the Fund for American Studies. I saw quite a few blurbs from some of our friends on the back of the book, from Yuval Levin and Josh Mitchell and Dan McCarthy and Sam Goldman. So a book worth reading. Well, before we get to the interview today, let me share a brief word about our show. This podcast is a production of ISI, and our mission is to educate for liberty. If you'd like to join us in that mission, head over to isi.org, and you can join for free to get exclusive offers, content, the Intercollegiate Review, and this podcast in your inbox every week. Now, let's get on to the interview.
All right, Johnny. So today, I'm going to interview you. We're going to talk a little bit about ISI. We're going to talk about a little bit about your conservatism, and we're going to talk about your speech that you gave to ISI a few months ago called Conservatism of the Heart. So let's start here. Tell me a little bit about yourself, and more specifically, how you first came in contact with ISI and the rest of your history with the organization.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, James. So I really got my introduction to ISI through ISI graduate and Weaver fellows who were teaching at Hillsdale College when I was a student there. I think there's upwards of 20 Weaver fellows who are teachers at Hillsdale College, not the least of which is Hillsdale College president Larry Arnn, who was a mentor of mine, and I had a course my senior year with him. The first semester was on Aristotle's Ethics, and the second semester was on C.S. Lewis. So I would say the immersion in my ISI experience began there. And then after graduating, I went on to graduate school to study theology in France. And when I returned, I participated in a year-long fellowship with the Trinity Forum, where I focused that year studying early Christian liturgical texts. And at the end of the year, I decided that I had enough theology and that I wanted to get back into politics. And so was looking at a number of, aligned conservative organizations on the East Coast, and decided to interview for a job in development at ISI. So I came to work at ISI for 2 years, from 2014 to 2016, working in fundraising, before I headed over to the American Conservative magazine based in Washington, D.C. I started out in development and then ended up being the executive director and the editor of the magazine before I got a phone call this summer inviting me to interview for the job of president at ISI. So that's my ISI story.
That's awesome. That's awesome. What are a few of the sort of ISI texts that you're always looking to? For me, it's, for example, Roots of the American Order is one that I'm always coming back to. What were those for you?
Yeah, I would say that The Conservative Mind was probably the most formative book for me, and it certainly really kicked off the whole conservative intellectual movement in America. I'm a huge fan of Russell Kirk and would consider myself to be a Kirkian conservative. So I keep coming back to The Conservative Mind. Another one, two actually really that influenced me are Richard Weaver's Ideas Have Consequences, and then also Robert Nisbet's Quest for Community, which I think is a masterful book.
And Quest for Community, one of the main texts of our honors conference this summer, and it was neat to watch students dig into that and sort of apply it to their lives today. Okay, so Johnny, one of the things you talk about in your Conservatism of the Heart speech is that ISI doesn't do policy. We don't help campaigns or support candidates, yet you also say that ISI is vital to rebuilding the American right. You say, quote, from a remnant into a governing majority in American life. Can you connect those dots for me and also explicitly sort of talk about why ISI isn't an activist organization? Why not, take political action to fix these problems?
Yeah, that's a great point. And I do think that political action is it's certainly necessary, and ISI has a number of partner organizations who focus more specifically on policy and student activism. And when we have students that are interested in getting equipped to do either one of those, we have a number of partners, and many of them are ISI alumni who we connect them with for internships and for mentorship opportunities. The real focus of ISI is on education and educating the next generation of people that will go on to be American leaders, whether it's statesmen or whether it's business leaders or teachers and professors. And so I think that, a lot of conservatives, they're really bent out of shape about the election, and their focus is primarily on short-term political battles. And while those are very important, we also need someone to take the long view. And that's really the vision that Frank Chodorov laid out when ISI was founded in his essay For Our Children's Children, where he said that if we're going to take this country back from the dominant sort of progressive ideology that has taken hold, we need to take the long view and focus on educating students on the principles of our Western and Judeo-Christian heritage, the American founding, as well as the tradition of a free and humane economy. And so that's our focus at ISI.
I think it's interesting, even in your answer, right, you can see the same attitude, right? You went back to the history of ISI.
That's right.
And I think that's so important. I think that's something that ISI students learn to do. It's something I learned to do as an ISI student myself. So another a quote that I want to sort of hone in on for a few minutes. You write, in order to be free, you must be good. What do you mean by that? And why is that foundational to ISI?
Yeah, in response to that, I'd actually like to quote John Adams. There's a John Adams quote that really stuck out to me. And he says, public virtue cannot exist in a nation without private virtue. And public virtue is the only foundation of republics. There must be a positive passion for the public good, the public interest, honor, power, and glory established in the minds of the people, or there cannot be any republican government or any real liberty. And this public passion must be superior to all private passions. So what I'm getting at in terms of, in order to be free, we must first become good, is that, freedom is a great responsibility. And in order to exercise it properly, we need to control our passions. And that's hard work. It takes a lot of discipline, and it takes an education to do that. So our goal at ISI is to not only educate for liberty, but to prepare people for liberty. And when people, first start out on the path to virtue, they don't necessarily like being good. They might want to be good, but it's hard work. It really, at first they understand what the good is, but they can't really live up to it. And then in time, through habituation, they can learn to align their desires with their character. And so really that, from my perspective, it's that work of character formation that we're doing at ISI.
Absolutely. What you just said there made me think of, have you read The Great Divorce? Seriously.
I have read The Great Divorce.
Yeah. So, that scene where the angel is saying to the man, well, I can take it off. I can take that off of you. Right. And the guy's like, I don't really want that, and that's so true.
Yeah,
right.
Absolutely.
Becoming good is really a task, and it's not something you can just turn on the switch for. Right. You rather have to work at it. You have to educate yourself too.
And, I do think, someone might push back and say, well, you can also flip it on its head. In order to be good, you also need a degree of freedom. And I think that's certainly true. There is a synergy here. People that, that grow up, with controlling or domineering or abusive parents or in too shelter of an environment really, don't necessarily have the freedom to, it's kind of like riding a bicycle. You got to fall off a few times and scrape your knee and get back up. And so there has to be a ground where people can experiment and learn not only to, stand on the faith and the ideas of their parents, but really stand on their own 2 feet. So it's a two-way street here.
One of the other things you mentioned in your speech, you say that what our country needs right now is teachers and friends, and that ISI is here to provide that. In fact, you say that the fate of our civilization depends on it. I mean, that's it's pretty high bar for teachers and friends. And so I think so let's say I walked into downtown Wilmington, right? And I stop with someone on the street and I'm saying, okay, the state of our country, our country is at stake. Our civilization is at stake. What do we need? I don't think that they would immediately respond, teachers and friends, right? So when you say, that we need teachers and friends, that ISI is here to provide that, what do you mean by that? Can you expand a little bit on why you think what we need is teachers and friends?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that, ISI really focuses on first principles and foundations. And, there are a million things wrong with the country that could use various policy solutions that could sort of ameliorate different problems in different ways. But if you're just really looking at, okay, what are the most foundational things that without them you can't live a good life or have a good society? It really comes down to faith. It comes down to family, meaningful work, and being able to live in a society where you can pursue a virtuous life. And, I think the most foundational component of this is teachers and friends. And so it begins, in the home with the teaching that you receive from your parents and the friendship that you have with your siblings, which then serve as a model for how you interact with your teachers and your peers in school, and then eventually your professors at the university level. So I think if we want to grow in virtue and if we want to have a free society, you need people who can form you and show you the way of the great tradition, people with more experience and wisdom than ourselves. And we also need friends who can spur us on, because iron sharpens iron.
I think that, community often acts like a mirror, right? And you get to sort of see yourself, and you can help the peers around you can help you habituate yourself to be better. And so I think that friends piece is especially important. All right. So now let's talk a little bit about ISI's educational model. You say in your speech, we aren't like French revolutionaries, we're not social justice activists, but rather we survey the collected wisdom of the ages as expressed in word, deed, and creed, and apply the insights prudentially to our concrete circumstances in 21st century American life. So expand on that a little bit for me. Why? I mean, the wisdom of the ages, right? A lot of people view the past as exactly that, the past, and we don't need to go back to it, So why should we sort of sit at the feet of the great tradition and try to learn from it?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the short answer is that those who don't know, the past are bound to repeat the worst lessons from the past. And so, I think this is really the reason that people don't know and respect history is ultimately because they're foolish and they need to be taught something. And this is something that our founder, William F. Buckley, said. The students really don't know what they ought to know or what they ought to like. It really comes down to people with more experience and wisdom, sitting at their feet and saying, hey, let's take a look at what texts have survived the test of time, because if something has endured the test of time, there must be some truth quality to it. And so, that's our approach at ISI. Let's take a look at the great tradition, not only the words of great men and women, but also their deeds, and begin to imitate them and begin to apply those lessons for our life today.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, one thing that's coming to mind right now is Russell Kirk, actually, when he talks about being, and he quotes, I think, I can't remember, there was someone long before him who said it first, but he talks about being, men standing on the shoulders of giants, right? I think oftentimes we forget that we wouldn't be where we currently are intellectually, technologically, any of these different things without those who came before us. And maybe we're willing to say that technological advancements in the past are important, but we often forget the philosophical.
That's right.
Or
absolutely.
the theological. So I think it's a really important way to approach education. Okay, so let's get right down to it. Sort of the crux of what you're talking about here in this speech: conservatism of the heart. What is that? Yeah,
so I, emphasized conservatism of the heart because I think there's a tendency, especially among conservatives, for, the sort of, especially among conservative intellectuals, for their conservatism to be very abstract and, just disconnected from ordinary life, and also disconnected from the lives of ordinary Americans. And so there's sort of two parts to it. One part is, that conservatism of the heart is really about not just a mental assent to conservative principles, but really a whole-bodied way that encompasses your mind, your body, your soul, your spirit, and living that out within the context of the community and friendship. So, I think that holistic approach to conservatism is very important. And then I also think, conservative intellectuals can also be disconnected with the bulk of the country who really knows nothing about conservative ideas. They haven't read any classic conservative books, but they share, largely speaking, sort of the habits and the dispositions that conservatives have. And so I think it's really important to figure out how conservative intellectuals can connect with these people. And going to George Washington, who I know we're going to touch on next, he really did not have the sort of rigorous classical education that many of the other founders like Jefferson had. He learned chiefly through experience, leading armies and serving his country. And, so I think in my view, he turned out to be a better man than Jefferson was. So I think there's, some lessons for us if the founder and father of our country, learned his conservatism through experience. I think that's an interesting insight for us to keep in mind today.
One thing you just mentioned really reminds me of, have you ever listened to the Renovatio podcast, Hamza Yusef?
I have not.
Okay,
no.
So he interviewed Roger Scruton once,
okay.
And I recently listened to it. And in there, Scruton's talking about how you sort of, when you start learning, you learn to be progressive. And then as you continue to learn, you relearn to be conservative, right? And it's so fascinating because I think I went through this exactly myself, right? Like I left my small town and I was like, oh, well, those people didn't really think very much. And it's like, well, that's not right at all. You know, that what's right is that they have this disposition, which is spot on.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And I think it's important to have both the sort of action and the disposition as well as the learning that comes with time. Okay, let's dive into George Washington.
Okay.
Right? So you associate George Washington with two virtues in your speech. You say that George Washington exemplifies love and humility. Mm-hmm. Talk to me a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think if you take a look at Washington's farewell address, the thing that really stands out to me is the affection, the incredible amount of affection he has for this country. This is something that he risked his livelihood and his sacred honor to defend and to establish. And, he really believes that in order for our country to have a future, there must be national unity, and that national unity really is, boils down to a shared love of this land, the people, the place where we live, and also the experiment in liberty that we have here. And I think he also exemplifies humility, chiefly because he, after serving 2 terms, like I mentioned before, knew when it was time to retire and step into the background and head home to Mount Vernon. And I think, if you're just looking at throughout the history of the world, how many leaders who at the pinnacle of their powers and their influence and, has the full support of the American people and the military would step down and retire. And I think that example will live on many, many centuries from now as a model of humility. And it certainly is one that I think is worth emulating for our students.
Before we jump on to the next character in your speech, I'm wondering, how did you first stumble? Like, what was the first thing that drew you to Washington? Right, because you talk about Washington a little bit, and so I'm wondering, how did you sort of dive into that?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and I think it also touches on a lot of other things. I mean, my first real kind of deep exposure to Washington was summer going into my freshman year at Hillsdale. Every freshman was sent a biography of George Washington, which was an excellent biography, and but I would say it was really a few years ago. I was after reading Patrick Deneen's book, Why Liberalism Failed, and then preparing to write an article about a State of the Union address that was happening that year, I decided just to kind of print off every the inaugural address, the farewell address, and sort of every State of the Union address that George Washington gave. It's not that long. I mean, it's probably 40 or 50 pages, and just kind of read through them to see, what was his vision for America and the country. And I was really surprised. I think, it stood out to me that a lot of the criticisms that Patrick Deneen has about our contemporary culture sort of being, autonomous individuals just seeking to sort of maximize our utility, whether it's using the market to achieve that or the state. Washington just stood out to me both in his example and his words to be really a counterexample to that, to be someone who exemplified virtue, who saw, a very robust role for faith in American life. And his Thanksgiving address, he says it's not only the duty of individuals to acknowledge God, he says it's the duty of nations to acknowledge God. And so I really saw in Washington sort of a robust model of virtue and faith that specifically related to, the underpinnings of the American experiment. So that's really what drew me to Washington. And then also, if you look at some of the policy ideas that Washington embodied, I think there's a lot of lessons for today. There's 4 really that kind of stood out to me from his farewell address. The first one is that, religion and morality are sort of indispensable supports for the American regime. So there's a social conservatism that permeates Washington's thought. In foreign affairs, Washington highlights not being excessively sort of intertwined and entangled in foreign conflicts that don't serve the national interests of the American people. In terms of political economy, Washington believes in, free and cordial trading relationships with countries, but he also acknowledges a place in providing for our national self-defense and for essential supplies for things to be made here in America. And I think we experienced that this year with the COVID crisis, having a lot of our essential medical supplies made in China. And then finally concluding with his vision of national unity. There's really a sense in which in order for this experiment to work, we have to put the idea of being an American citizen over and above our local prejudices. And we need to, really not alienate any one portion of the country from the rest. And I think, again, right now in our country, there are many parts of the nation, many states feel like they're alienated from the whole of the republic. So I think, just down the line, whether you're looking at his life, whether you're looking at his understanding of America, or even his policy ideas, there are very important lessons for us to draw today.
Looking back to the founders is something that a sort of, maybe not always a simple way, but, an easy way for students to sort of just try to imbibe the idea of America and learn it for themselves. One of the things we've been doing recently is we pushed out a new seminar, The American Experiment, right, where students are getting to engage with the ideas of the founders and other important figures in the American experiment. Yeah. So, second figure, Sullivan Ballou. Mm-hmm. Who is Sullivan Ballou, and why does he exemplify piety and duty?
Yeah, well, Sullivan Ballou was a colonel from, I believe it was Rhode Island, who was serving in the Civil War. And the evening before one of the big battles he was about to fight in, he, was laying in bed and he was writing a letter to his wife. He was laying in bed likely in a tent or underneath the stars in camp. And, he wrote a letter to his wife basically saying goodbye to her. He had this sort of overwhelming sense that his time on Earth was about to be up, and that fate or destiny or providence was calling him to the battlefield, where he was very happy to lay down his life for his country and for his children and posterity. And he was wrestling with the fact that he loved his wife dearly, and he knew that he would never be able to see her again in person. And so my point, connecting that to conservatism of the heart, is that, his virtues were not merely intellectual. If that was sort of an intellectual or abstract faith in America, he probably would have been tempted to sneak out of camp and head back to Rhode Island. But since he had this whole-souled commitment to our country and to the freedoms that it provided, he was willing to lay down his life. So I can't think of anything more dutiful or pious than that.
And so the last figure in your speech that you associate with the virtues of goodness and courage is Teddy Roosevelt. Mm-hmm. So that might come as a surprise to some folks. So why'd you pick Teddy?
Yeah, I mean, I picked Teddy because I think he's a lot of fun. Yeah. I think, he certainly is seen as, and rightly so, as an early progressive figure, mostly because he had, criticisms of, the big, big banks and big corporations at the time, and sort of their impact on the American workers and American families. But I think in spite of the aspects of him which are progressive, I think his love of America and, the American frontier, his desire to go west and kind of explore and sort of develop these, chivalric virtues and fight to serve, his country and in Cuba. I just think there's a lot in his life that, if you're just reading his speeches and his journals, it's hard to come away and not feel inspired. Like he loved the country, and he had a sense of patriotism that I think, would make many progressives blush today to see someone love America that much. So I think Teddy should be, I think he should be included in the canon of patriots.
So let's talk a little bit about W.E. Du Bois, the talented 10th. So one of the things you talk about how sort of ISI is trying to educate the talented 10th of the conservative movement. And you say this is explicitly, this is not an elitist move on the part of ISI. So I think this is actually remarkably similar to the way that Chodoroff saw himself, in 1953 when he was founding ISI. At least, based on sort of George Nash's assessment of the situation, it seemed like he was seeing himself as kind of gathering Knox remnant to himself, right, and to ISI. So my question is this: how do we educate the elite without being elitist?
Yeah. No, that's a great point. And I think it kind of relates to sort of the rise of populism that we've seen in this country. And I think the American people, the populace, has rightly ascertained that the elites in our country are corrupt, right? They have they put their own private interests above the interests of the country. They lack the public virtue that John Adams talked about. But I think the one critique that I would have of just full-throated populism is that at the end of the day, there is always going to be an elite class or a talented 10th or whatever phrase you want to use, right? There's always going to be people in charge that are making important decisions about the future of our country, about the future of industry in America, and they're not going away. So the question becomes, who are those people? What do they know? What are their habits? Who are their friends? And, I think in terms of ISI's emphasis, we're a nonprofit organization. We have limited resources. if we had unlimited resources, maybe we would approach it differently, but our focus is really to say, who are the people, the talented 10th, who can, become the next generation of American leaders? And what type of education do they need? And that's really where we rely on the tradition and the curriculum that we've put together over the past 70 years and focus on educating and mentoring these people and then connecting them with leaders in public policy and law and business that have come through ISI before them, so that they can be waiting in the wings, so that when we have the opportunity, so that they can be, the people shaping our country. And I think another important thing that I would stress is that in order to educate the elite without being elitist, the people that are making decisions about America really need to have a deep understanding for the lives of ordinary Americans. They need to spend time outside of the bubbles of Washington and New York, and they need to have the interests of ordinary people at heart. So I think as long as that's the case, it's okay with having a talented 10th.
Last question. You talk about durable conservatism. Mm-hmm. What do you mean by that, and why is it important for someone to have a durable conservatism? And maybe in addition to that, what are some of the, maybe the figures or the thinkers that helped you sort of develop a durable conservatism yourself? Yeah,
absolutely. So I think there certainly is a foundation, that is shared by all conservatives, and it draws from the things which I've, already mentioned: the Western tradition, the American founding, the lives of, great men and women throughout American and world history. But, my emphasis on durable conservatism, really boils down to the fact that the circumstances that we live in change over time, and the application of our principles looks different from one era to the next. And so I think that there had been within the conservative movement a little bit of an ossification, where there was the policies got confused with the principles, right? So whether it's after the Cold War, it looked like the end of history was here, that America would forever lead sort of this global transformation to sort of free democratic societies, and that really did not end up happening, and I think one sort of case in point is China. Many people thought after they joined the World Trade Organization that they would continue to liberalize as they were exposed to American ideas and ideals and Western institutions, and the opposite really ended up happening. And so if you look at a policy like free trade, sort of just in a vacuum, you're not going to come to the same conclusions that if you're looking at the question of free trade when you're dealing with, a rival great power who is using the trading system and cheating in various ways to really harm American industries and the American worker to advance their national power on the world stage. So, when it comes to conservatism, it's less about being dogmatic about particular policy solutions that worked in the past, and more about, thinking prudentially about how our principles and the lessons from history apply to the concrete challenges and threats that we face today.
Johnny, I think we'll wrap it up there. I really appreciate you doing this today, and I enjoyed your speech, and I look forward to more episodes of the podcast.
Thanks so much, James.
So, thank you for listening to Conservative Conversations with ISI. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please feel free to head over to isi.org/resources to see all of the other resources we offer our members, including the Intercollegiate Review, Modern Age, ISI books, and of course, this podcast. Thanks again for listening, and we will see you all next time on Conservative Conversations with ISI.